welcome everyone to this panel that is focused on achieving security progress in post-conflict contexts. My name's Susan Nicolai, and I head the Development Progress Project, of which this research is a part. Just to give you a bit of context, Development Progress is a project that's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's focused on trying to help us understand how progress has actually happened in different contexts and across different sectors. It was a project that was originally conceived around the time of the midterm of the Millennium Development Goals, and there was a lot of negativity at that time around how well the world was doing against these goals. And the feeling was that's not really the full story. You know, despite the challenges in reaching those specific goals, there are many things that have seen progress. And so actually let's try to look at some of those and better understand those. So we went through a process now several years ago actually of doing a huge work around data analysis, looking at a number of different key indicators across 8 different dimensions of well-being, security being one of those, to identify countries that had shown strong progress according to the available data. And then we do recognize, of course, there's lots of concerns about that data. But we then also worked with people on doing kind of qualitatively checking that and triangulating that, and ended up selecting a number of countries to do case studies on. By the end of the project period, by around June this year, we'll have 50 case studies of progress across a number of sectors: education, health, environment, political voice, etc. And security, of course, is one of those. I've found it really interesting to work with the researchers on the security dimension. My own background is coming very much from the humanitarian world, where I spent 10 years working in humanitarian and post-conflict settings, trying to do something that we might term more the development side of things, education, but running into lots of challenges and interactions in terms of how security affected these development efforts. And so I think, definitely see the links and the connections of security being a foundation of well-being and progress. So it's been really interesting to be a part of these studies. And I worked for quite some time in Timor-Leste 10 years ago in some of the early days, and have been in and out of Liberia a few times as well. So I hope you'll enjoy some of the discussions today and be challenged by them, because I think that there's really challenging issues. What we're going to do today is have a 2 panel sessions, essentially. The first session will be a presentation of some of the research, and we'll first have Lisa Denny, who's on video connection, I believe. There she is. She'll be presenting an introduction to how the research on the security dimension has been approached. And Lisa was a research fellow here at ODI for several years, working on peace building and fragile states, and has much of her research has focused specifically on Sierra Leone, but she oversaw this research as a whole. And then we're going to be turning to Craig Valters, who will be presenting the Liberia case study. And he's part of the Politics and Governance program here, and has worked variously on dispute resolution in post-war Sri Lanka, worked on efforts around theories of change, and was also worked across the research for this work, so not just the Liberia case study. And then we also have Juana de Cato, who comes most recently from the OECD INCAF, International Network on Conflict and Fragility. She'll be presenting the Timor-Leste case study, and she's got a long CV, I guess, working on some of these issues on resource flows to fragile states, and has worked as well with the Paris Declaration on Fragile States Principles. So I think I'll turn it over to Lisa now to help frame our discussions.
Thanks very much, Susan, and thanks very much, everyone, for joining us for this launch event and for your interest in the research more broadly. Before we get into the meat of the case studies, I just wanted to make some brief remarks in relation to three areas. First of all, in relation to our methodology for how we've looked at security progress. Secondly, on some of the factors that we found have been driving progress. And then finally, on some of the big questions that we have been grappling with and that really we continue to grapple with. So in relation to our approach to understanding security progress, we were interested really in what drives security progress in countries emerging from conflict, given that conflict is widely perceived to be one of the main inhibitors of broader development. So this begged the question of what counts as security progress in these particular post-conflict contexts. So we know post-conflict transitions are messy, non-linear, complex processes, and that security problems like crime and violence against women persist despite improvements in security situations more broadly. So it's likely that the progress we're going to see in these cases is only going to be partial and relative, but nonetheless important. So in order to capture this limited but important security progress, our understanding of what counts as progress needed to also be quite modest. And for that reason, while we believe in the ideal of human security as a long-term goal, given the low starting points and the limited progress that we can expect to see in post-conflict contexts, this wasn't a useful standard by which to measure progress in this case. So we needed something that was more modest in the interim that would enable us to capture small intervals of progress along the way. And for that reason, we focused on reductions in physical threats to personal safety, particularly by the state itself, as a more limited approach to security, but one that's still important in protecting lives and livelihoods and in providing a foundation for wider development progress. So to find countries that demonstrated this kind of security progress, we initially undertook an analysis of a number of international data sets on battle deaths, homicides, sexual violence, flows of refugees and internally displaced persons. Then we also looked at some aggregate indicators like the Global Peace Index and the Rule of Law Index. And then from the countries that emerged as front runners, or post-conflict countries that emerge as front runners from that analysis, we then dug into some qualitative research on those countries to see whether a progress story was tenable, and also to look at some perception surveys within the countries to see whether citizens' perspectives also showed some kind of progress story. So it's through that process that we arrived at the case studies of Liberia and Timor-Leste. And it's important to say before we get into them that we're not holding these cases up as success stories to be emulated. We recognize that there are deep ongoing security and other developmental challenges in these contexts. Rather, we're looking at them as instances where some degree of progress, however incomplete, has taken place that we think other countries can learn from, and that other researchers and practitioners who are interested in building security and what it takes to build security in post-conflict contexts can also learn from. And we were also interested in issues of equality and sustainability in security progress, asking who is security for and who is excluded, and what implications is this likely to have in the longer term. So one of the interesting findings from the research is that the very things that drive security in the short term can also undermine security in the longer term if issues of inclusivity and equity aren't dealt with. And Craig and Joanna will speak to this in a bit more detail in the case studies. So I think that's all I'll say on the methodology. It's rarely, obviously, the most interesting part of research, but for anybody who's interested, we did produce a background paper at the outset of the project that will be available outside the conference room. So if you want to take a look or follow up with us, please do feel free. In terms of the drivers that we found have contributed to security progress, we obviously came across multiple in the case studies, and we found that these existed at least three levels: the international level, national level, and subnational level. and international we've kind of collapsed regional into as well. So at the international level, we're really looking at things like either regional or international peacekeeping operations, donor-led security sector reform programs, and donor financial flows more broadly. At the national level, we were interested in the political settlement, the personalities of key leaders, and the approach taken to potential spoilers of the peace. And then at the subnational level, it was really about how local communities resolve disputes and prevent their escalation, often through informal or customary dispute resolution processes. So again, the case study presentations will obviously go into the specific factors that we found drove progress in those areas, but we found these levels a useful device for sort of organizing the different factors a little. And then finally, just to sort of mention some of the big questions, I guess, that we've been thinking about and that our research sort of starts to answer, but that we really recognize are ongoing and difficult questions. And I'll just mention 3 of those. So the first relates to the methodological problem. When looking at security progress, which is inevitably always going to be for some groups within society more than others, how do we determine what counts as progress? And this really came up for us in particular in relation to Liberia, where there are such high rates of violence against women, which raised the question of, where half of your population continues to face, a really pertinent security question or security threat. To what extent can you say that there has been progress more broadly? So this is something that we sort of grappled with. Another relates to the weight placed on the various factors that drive progress. As I say, we sort of broke them into international, national, and subnational factors. Obviously, a lot of literature on peacekeeping or on international peace-building efforts, written as it is sort of from often a Western perspective, often prioritizes international factors in achieving security progress. And that's something that our research questioned and would be interesting to pick up again in the discussion afterwards. And then finally, we were interested in whether the things that drive short-term security gains are the same things that promote longer-term sustainable and equitable progress. And if they're not the same, how do you then make the shift from those short-term solutions to the longer-term solutions? So these are questions that will emerge throughout the presentations and hopefully get picked up in the discussion and debate afterwards. There are also things that we've sort of started to grapple with in a paper, a dimension paper, as we've called it, a paper that's come after the case studies. There's a draft of that available as well outside the conference room. This is still incomplete, and we're sort of hoping that the discussion today will help us to crystallize our thoughts in this regard. But please do feel free to take a copy, and if you have any thoughts, please feel free to get in touch. So with those preliminary remarks, I'll hand back to Susan so we can get on with the case studies. Thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed discussion.
Great, thanks. And Lisa, are you staying with us until at least the end of this session?
I will stay as long as possible. Yeah, I'll try and stay. It's currently just 1:45 in the morning here in Australia,
yes,
so I'll stay for as long as I can manage.
As you might guess, Lisa's in Australia, so thank you very much for being with us. So we'll turn over to Craig to present the Liberia case study.
Do we have the slides? Okay, so in this presentation, is my mic on? So in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through the kinds of achievements we think Liberia has got to, how they got there, and then also some of the challenges that are ongoing in the country and some of the tensions that have emerged with the short-term and long-term factors that Lisa's just alluded to. And I think that question is one that runs throughout both case studies, but particularly through this presentation, it's one to bear in mind with Liberia, is whether the short-term factors that I'm about to outline can feasibly drive sustainable peace over the longer term. So what has been achieved in Liberia? I think firstly, we need a reminder of the starting point in this case. Now, Liberia experienced many years of civil war between 1989 and 2003. Now, during that time, over 250,000 people died. And in one study where 96% of people said they had been affected by the war, the vast majority of those had been affected by displacement, sexual violence, and other forms of assault. At the same time, over many, many years, Liberia's security forces have generally protected elite interests rather than the citizenry. Now, as the quote behind me suggests, while we've come from a very low starting point, there has been remarkable progress. Most importantly, there's been a major drop in conflict events in Liberia, coinciding, of course, with the end of the conflict in 2003. There's also been a marked decline in violence perpetrated by the state, directly by state security forces. Now, these two factors alone, in my opinion, demonstrate the core of Liberia's story and why we recognise it as a story of progress. There are also a spate of studies around 2009 and 2010 which look at other forms of violence in Liberia and actually also suggest there have been year-on-year improvements, for example, in crime-related violence and also in other forms of interpersonal violence, such as assault. They've also pointed to improving perceptions of security in the country. And by that I mean that people recognise that their security is improved, but also that it may continue to improve in the future and that the peace will hold. Now, actually with these latter studies that I've mentioned, I think we probably have to have some caution in how we interpret them today. As I mentioned, most of them are from around 2009 or 2010. Now, firstly, of course, that's 4 years ago. And if you look at the graph behind me, you can see that there has actually been an upkick of conflict events from around 2010, 2011 onwards. Now, our interviews in Liberia suggest that that reflects a growing dissatisfaction in the country, linked in part to growing expectations many years after the conflict, but also to what people perceive as broken political promises. Secondly, and this is more of a general point about a caution with Liberia, we know that security has not improved for everyone. And if you take a quick look at the map behind me, which is showing how safe or secure people feel, with red essentially being bad and green essentially being good, you can see that people's perceptions of security vary massively depending on where they are. And if you look at Monrovia there, which is the darkest red, you can see that people's perceptions of security are actually very poor. So whilst this study was also conducted in 2011, it just gives us a word of caution on how we interpret the security improvements that we've seen. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that the improvements in Liberia that we have seen in terms of reductions of armed conflict and political violence perpetrated by the state have been absolutely essential and also preconditions for any further movements and declines in other forms of violence in the country. So what has driven change in Liberia? In the first instance, of course, there was a comprehensive peace agreement that was signed in 2003. Now, this peace agreement brought a range of warring parties to the table, and that in itself has been an important factor for the peace that has been sustained. However, we've actually moved beyond this immediate point, and I want to make one overarching point throughout these drivers of change that I'll outline. And that's that the most important factor that has driven security progress in Liberia has been political stability in the country. And that political stability has been underwritten by a range of regional, national and local factors, which I'll dive into now. So as you can see, the first one I want to talk about here is local level security. Now, when we first started looking at the Liberia case, and you're confronted with a statistic like this, where the most predominant response when people are asked what is your source of security is nobody, you start to wonder how these things come about. Now, this can tell you a number of things, but based on our research, I would suggest that, firstly, citizens have taken a considerable amount of responsibility for their own safety in Liberia. And if you look at the third column there, of community watch groups, that's what that reflects. That's informal security actors at the local level. But what it also points out is that, of course, security isn't just dependent on those actors that we presumably rely on to provide security. It's dependent on a huge range of other factors. Now, in Liberia, UN peacekeeping troops came in about 2 months after the end of the conflict. Now, they have underwritten the peace in Liberia, but what's interesting about them is that actually UN peacekeeping troops have very rarely intervened in any active conflict in the country. But our interview suggests that they've been important insofar as being a deterrent to armed violence, but also being part of kind of being symbolic in the country as a commitment of international actors to peace, which was lacking in previous years. Now, the UN peacekeeping troops have also played a role in making sure the country is stable enough that politics can continue in this way. Now, after 2 years of transitional government in Liberia, between 2003 and 2005, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected as president. Now, she was the first female elected African president, and partly because of that, she had considerable international support, but she also drew on her experiences working for the World Bank, working for UNDP. So, to some extent, a lot of the international praise around Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has been vindicated, insofar as, over her 2 administrations to date, she's still in power, there's been a much greater commitment from the Liberian government to human rights, essentially. There's been a decrease in political persecution. There's been some attempts to reorientate how the security forces deal with citizens, although that's got a long way to go. And I think that's been a really important part of the changes that we've seen. But as the quote behind me implies, the way that politics unfolds in Liberia does not fit within a Western liberal model of how we might think, or how people might assume things unfold when there are improvements. Now, what I mean by that is that for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to have been successful in governing the country over the last many years, she has to have been able to manage a huge range of informal and formal power structures across the country. Now, there are a large number of people in the country, elites, who had involvement in the war, that were bought into the peace and have been accepted into government patronage structures across the country. Now, when you speak to people in Liberia about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's squeaky clean image, often the first thing they'll tell you is that that's not quite right. And perhaps that's the best example of that is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was undertaken in Liberia, which suggested that she, along with 48 others, should be barred from political office for 30 years. Now, this is in part linked to her political history in the country. But perhaps the kind of interesting and slightly controversial point here is that, well, the question to be raised, is that could Ellen Johnson Sirleaf have possibly governed well in this country in absence of a deep political history in the country and the ability to manage these different powerful actors? I mean, for example, former senior associates of Charles Taylor have been incorporated into the government structures that I mentioned. Now, obviously, this risks continuing practices that, in fact, were some of the grievances around that developed into a conflict in the first place, but in the short term, I think have been important in stabilising the country. Now, in the case studies, we dig into 2 more factors, which I'll discuss together right now, and that's security sector reform and international support for peace in Liberia. Now, these are tricky ones because in both cases, you'll be very hard-pressed to find anyone who says they weren't essential to building peace in the country. Yet you'll also be very hard-pressed to find anyone who says that they've gone well. Both international support has been said to lead to a top-down path for security sector reform, so that security sector reform doesn't stick, and a lack of local ownership in the country. But at the same time, in the absence of this, we will have to wonder what would have happened. And this is not just about security sector reform, but large-scale technical and financial assistance that the international community has provided. Now that leads me on to the challenges in Liberia, of which there are plenty. I have to say, I think something that's kind of one of the most interesting things about Liberia's case is actually the fact that this progress in security has happened in spite of so many ongoing problems. And so I could go on, but I'm going to list 4. The first of those is that Liberia remains one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, if you look at the graph behind me, that shows that Liberia has the highest rate of multidimensional poverty in the region. Now, this is important in its own right, but it's also important from a security perspective. And that links to my second point, which is that in Liberia, there were over 100,000 combatants that went through the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process. And many reports suggest that that did not go so well, and people have not been able to benefit and get full-scale employment afterwards. So you're in a situation where there is massive socioeconomic inequality, and you have a huge number of former combatants. Now, I don't want to suggest that former combatants are sitting around waiting to fight, because I think that's a bad way to view things. Most of them just want jobs like any other civilian after the end of a conflict. At the same time, these are quite dangerous conditions to be having in the country. The third element relates to security sector reform and security provision more generally in the country. As the quote behind me implies, the Liberian police simply do not have the logistical capacity to provide security across the country. Now, in truth, they've never really done that. The Liberian police has, for a long time, been a source of insecurity for people. So in that context, it's actually unrealistic to expect them to be able to do this. And in our report, we dig more into that and suggest that working more with local informal structures of dispute resolution would be a good way to go, or at least has been neglected to date. The final challenge I'd like to outline is in relation to land conflicts and resource extraction. This is a hot topic, if you like, in Liberia at the moment. And if you remember the graph that I had earlier on the screen with the upkick of conflict events, that is in some respects tied to protests around extractive industries in the country. So this is an ongoing issue. Just to finish, I think I have 30 seconds now. Just to finish, perhaps we can come back to the question which Lisa's outlined, which we started with, and which I think will be a running theme throughout. It's whether Liberia has built a sustainable peace. I'm sure you can feel my skepticism on some of these points. Let me just outline very quickly 3 of the things I've mentioned. UN security peacekeeping forces, essentially imposing peace. Secondly, that the ongoing patronage and power that is associated with Liberia's elite political settlement. And thirdly, the ongoing flows of international resources and the failure of security sector reform to truly stick in the country. Now, these 3 things, almost fairly obviously, are not sustainable over the longer term. So, for me, I think despite some of the negativity I suppose I've ended on, there is actually a lot of reason to be optimistic in Liberia. The progress they've seen in some respects is remarkable. But there's no doubt that there's a long, long way to go yet. And with that, I will pass to Joanna.
Great. And we'll hand over to Joanna now and then do a session of questions for both of them.
Thank you. So we'll travel across the globe to East Timor, which is the eastern part of a small island shared with its big neighbor, Indonesia. It's just 15,000 square kilometers, and its population is just 1.1 million people. Some of you may remember a cartoon around independence that represented 2 resistance fighters on a raft celebrating independence, but utterly alone on a very rough sea full of sharks. So that's, I think, is a good representation of where Timor was in '99. So it's a tiny half of an island. It's very far away from here. But it's a very significant case to study for a number of reasons. The first one is that it's the world's youngest nation, apart from South Sudan, which, as you may know, is embroiled in an all-out and bloody civil war. This is not the case in Timor. Timor has had a lot of growing pains, but it has not been embroiled in such a civil war, not on this scale at least. It was facing very considerable odds, first by carrying the referendum on independence in '99, and also, second, by not falling into this kind of civil war. So, as such, East Timor has lessons to share with other crisis-affected countries. And actually, as you may know, Timor is one of the leading voices in the G7+, a group of 20 crisis-affected countries that try to share experience and perspectives to say, in their own words, goodbye conflict, hello development. So, so these are a few reasons, and a final reason is that Timor has received $4.2 billion US in official development assistance since 1999. And in 2011, it received more aid per capita than Afghanistan or Liberia. So it's a big, it's clearly a donor darling. And it begs the question, was the investment of taxpayer money worth the investment, essentially? If you look at the baseline is this one. Over 100,000 deaths related to the Indonesian occupation over the period from 1975 to 1999, and more deaths around the referendum. So that's basically a history of mass-scale violence. Now, looking at the timeline, you see the events in yellow are the crises that have punctuated every 2 years or so the history since independence. So basically, it has not been smooth sailing since then, far from that. Actually, there's something that is quite significant on this timeline. You could say that during the occupation at independence, it was a war between the Timorese people and the militias backed by Indonesia. So it was us and the others. But since 2006-07, it's really a civil war among Timorese parties. Some like to summarize things by saying it's an issue between the eastern side of East Timor and the western side of East Timor, but of course it's a little more complicated than that. There's all kinds of histories and trajectories that date from the resistance, from the struggle. There's linguistic divides. There's land notions of national and community identity. There's all these different dimensions that pile on top of each other, and basically all these tensions. Analysts knew they were there, but nobody predicted that they would boil over into violence. And what happened in 2006 is that 150,000 people fled. That's 1 in 9 Timorese citizens fleeing from their house. And I can't help but make a parallel with South Sudan a year ago. We were all thinking, Darfur, Juba, and now it's between the freedom fighters. Okay, so now for the good news. Since 2009, security has made giant steps, whether you look at the number of incidents reported or if you look at what ordinary citizens say. So in terms of incidents reported by the police and recorded by local NGOs, they basically dropped by half over the time period 2009-2014. And in terms of perceptions, it's very much the same picture. In 2008, half of the people said they feel safer than the previous year. And then there was a survey in 2014, just last year, that says 68 people surveyed feel security is not just good, but it's very good. It's quite impressive, I think. Okay, beyond numbers, for me, the big headline here is that Timor had its share of crises and tensions since 2008, but none of these actually escalate in large-scale violence. What does it mean? Does it mean that the structural causes of the conflict have disappeared? Or does it mean that Timorese society is more resilient and is more able to manage differences peacefully, whether at the local level or at the national level? Clearly, the answer is yes to the second. There's greater resilience. Now, as to the structural causes of the conflict, have they disappeared? And here I'm thinking about the continued distrust between different Timorese groups. I mentioned the East and West and the linguistic groups. We can think of the unresolved grievances of certain veterans. We could think about the lack of jobs and opportunities when there's a demographic explosion in Timor. All these causes are worth looking at over the long run. And I would say, they have not disappeared. They're still there. So what are the drivers or causes of such remarkable progress? Here are some quotes for some of the 75 people that we interviewed. Craig and I, and also 2 local consultants, Sarah Dewhurst and Nelson Bellow. I don't think you can read, maybe it's too small, but basically some of these quotes relate to the attitudes and the roles of the Timorese leadership and their willingness to do things their own way, the Timorese way. And other quotes relate to the role of international support. So now let's have a closer look at that. So we identify 6 main drivers of security progress. The 3 in green at the bottom and the 3 in blue just above that. So we'll start at the bottom with the role of international support. Basically, the green causes are international in nature. The first one is peacekeeping, and the second one is aid. And the third one is the legitimization of Timor-Leste as a state and as a people. I'm quoting from a Timorese professor who mentioned that. These are 3 factors. I mean, we're quite surprised because when you read the literature, it's very critical of international support, whether it's on the peacekeeping side or on the aid side. People talk about horror stories, about blunders made in the early days, about an approach that was basically tabula rasa, treating Timor as an empty space with no structured leadership, divided communities, and so on. And so we all know all these things, but we were really surprised to hear people say, overall, not only the contribution of the international community was good, but it was significant. It was really important. So we could mention under the heading of peacekeeping what people think of Interfet, the first that was deployed in 1999, or we could mention the International Stabilization Force deployed in 2006. Both of them were viewed as very positive by the population. Under the rubric of the third one, legitimization of Timor-Leste, we were really surprised about this one because basically, a local NGO called Lau Hamutuk says there's been historic amnesia about Timor-Leste. Between 1975 and 1999, the international community basically ignored the plight of the Timorese people and their calls to reclaim their sovereignty. And then suddenly, the international community has played this really positive role in recognizing the country as the nation as a country. So that was quite surprising, but good to hear. Now let's, if we look at the national causes, I will briefly mention the strong political settlement that exists since 2012 among the elites, which stem very much from the charisma, the leadership of Shalana, the current prime minister and a resistance leader. And the second one was the policy of government to buy the peace. Suddenly they had a lot of oil and gas revenues. And when the revenues came on stream, it gave them the means, but also the confidence to basically decide what they're going to do. And sometimes they push back on the international community, push back on international good practices and conventional wisdom, and they said, well, we feel like paying each displaced person $4,000. And true enough, within 2 years, the IDP, the internal displaced people camps closed. So that's one example. Another example is around the veterans, which was a massive investment on the part of government, but so far so good. It worked. The potential spoilers are quiet. So that's that, and maybe just to also mention the third cause nationally is the village level negotiation of violence. I say negotiation because there's always a mix between the formal, the rule of law and traditional ways to resolve conflicts. So that was also quite an important factor. Now, to the challenges, here are some quotes about that. They basically indicate that short-term measures, such as buying the peace and making deals across elite groups, has been effective, but it may not work over the long run, because actually it weakens the rule of law and inclusion in the eyes of the people interviewed. Again, let's have a closer look. There's basically 4 challenges. I'm not sure why I picked an iceberg because it's under the tropics, but it shows that, below the water, you have these challenges. First of underreported or new forms of violence, such as gender-based violence. It seems to be a common theme in post-conflict societies. The second challenge is unfinished business in the security sector. Command and control is still a bit of a vague notion. And then the third challenge is that two of the drivers I mentioned, which are Shanana's leadership and the buying the peace approach, may not be sustainable. First of all, because Shanana indicated he will leave power. And second, because the oil and gas reserves are finite. We don't know whether they'll be replenished in 3 years or in 10 years, but they're finite, definitely. So basically, you have growing expectation on the part of the population, whether they're the bulging youth or the potential spoilers, and you have finite reserves. So that's an equation that they'll have to deal with. Okay, so in conclusion, I'll just want to contrast the headlines from the early days and with today's headlines. Before it was all stories about large-scale violence, and now it's more silent killers such as poverty and chronic malnutrition. More people die of malnutrition, by the way, than conflicts in Timor. So we can only hope that Timor-Leste demonstrate the same leadership and ability to devise its own way to deal with things in fighting those silent killers as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. What we'll do now is open it up for questions. We do have folks watching online as well, and even some of you in the room may be tweeting. So if those of you online, if you've got questions, the hashtag is hashtag SEC, S-E-C, Prague, P-R-O-G. So please do use that, and I'll see if there's any that come up, and we'll ask. So I'll open it up, and I think we'll take a few questions at a time. So does anyone want to start? Otherwise, I've got one to start with. I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask that, and if others have some to come. I'm struck with kind of the tension that you heard through interviews and in the research of the fact that yes, things have improved, and yet there's all these problems. And did you hear, with the given the benefit of hindsight, did you hear much from people about, well, if this had been done differently, or we wish this had been done differently? And I'm just wondering, maybe in each case, what were one or two of the things that came out that people would have liked to have seen differently?
I can take one first if you like. In the Liberian context, the one that comes through loud and clear is in relation to security sector reform. Now, security sector reform in Liberia is a really interesting case. In terms of the military was entirely disbanded and then reformed by an American private contractor called DynCorp. The police also went through a reform process heavily led by international actors. Now, in both cases, what a lot of civil society actors in Liberia are saying now, and actually at the time, was that there needed to be a huge, a much stronger engagement with that civil society that was there and ready to respond and give recommendations on how security sector reform could have unfolded. So a lot of that actually is about building on the capacities that already existed in the country. I mentioned sort of pre-existing forms of dispute resolution and the fact that the police have never provided security for Liberians across the country. And so there's been this international expectation based on pumping money in that at the end of this process, the police would be ready in some form. But the reality is they're not going to be ready anytime in the near future. So what could have been differently is engaging with local level actors that have already been providing security for many, many years and building a more multi-layered policing strategy into international support.
Okay, and with Timor-Leste?
Timor-Leste, well, it's interesting because people kept saying at some point we need to do things our own way. And they did. From 2005, 2006, when they managed to generate their own domestic revenues, they basically changed tack and they said, we're not going to do it your way. For example, they were really pulling to get the mandate for their own army and police to be fully regular or autonomous, which is funny, which is ironic, because you don't have to ask the mandate. I mean, it's their country. So maybe a better term is to say they reclaim their mandate. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I mentioned the early days, the blunders that were made, and the fact that the country was treated as an empty space. I think there's quite a high level of consensus about the fact that it was right to think about systems. It's right to think about state structures and capacity issues and so on. But it's also important to recognize the key role of personalities, and in this case, not only Shanana's role but also the other freedom fighters. So not just systems but also people. And then the third thing that comes to mind is hybrid security forums. In many other countries, Sierra Leone, Burundi, and so on, the police is a bit limited in its ability to basically to implement the rule of law, and so there's a role for the communities to really interact with them. And this has, community policing, we keep hearing about this term when we visit it with government, but in reality, local commanders don't have the resources or even guidance in terms of what it means in reality.
Okay. And just a reminder, in terms of questions, that Lisa, I think, is still online, so if anyone has questions about some of the broader approach as well. So Alina, then Kate. And if you can say your name and where you're from.
Alina Rocha Menocal from the Developmental Leadership Program at the University of Birmingham. I was curious, Juana, you mentioned the word structural causes of conflict, and I was wondering if both of you perhaps can delve a little bit more deeply into whether or not the respective countries that you have dealt with have made progress addressing those perhaps more structural conditions. And also, if I may, I think there's a really interesting ongoing debate or conversation about how peace building relates or doesn't relate to state building. And I think you picked up on some really interesting tensions within peace that may cause problems going forward. So I was wondering if you could delve into that question as well. Thanks.
Okay. And then Kate here.
Hello, Kate Bird, Development Progress ODI. I've got a question about poverty and inequality. Both case studies raised poverty and inequality as challenges for the future. And it strikes me that it's often quite difficult for people from the humanitarian side of development to work with people from the development side of development because of the different professional backgrounds and emphases in the way that they're trained and the work that they do. And this seems to me to be a real challenge for thinking about how to deal with post-conflict reconstruction in countries like Liberia and Timor-Leste. How would you say that should be addressed, given that without addressing it, the likelihood is that conflict will re-emerge, and also given the fact that the most persistent and chronic poverty seems to be highly concentrated in fragile and conflict-affected states. So dealing with poverty and inequality is not something that can be ignored in the post-2015 world.
That's a big one, I think. We've got another question back here.
Thank you. Pauline Oti. Sorry, I've got cold, so my voice is a little bit hoarse. I'm a consultant to the UN system, and I've led 2 missions to Liberia. I haven't had the opportunity of reading the details of your study and your methodology, but the striking first in Monrovia, in Liberia, lots of donor support, but it's all poured in Monrovia town. There's so much regional disparity and poverty inland. So that all those soldiers that came back That's why they're still floating around. They're not educated. They can't fit into the system. The avenues are not there. Everything is in Monrovia. Donors come. They come to Monrovia, they're impressed, they pour more money, and they go away. The hinterland, you can hardly go. 3 years ago, I went back as an international observer to the presidential system, presidential election. We had no roads to go into the hinterland to monitor the elections. The donor agencies had to provide helicopters. There are no resources there at all. So I don't know how it should impact on what you found and the progress to be made in future. Otherwise, the delicate balance of peace you are looking at. The second part is the ethnicity factor. Most of the rulers have been the Creoles, those that came back as slaves from America, while the majority of the indigenous people are still far behind in educational status and can hardly partake in the development process. And unless there is some sort of balancing factors, as you said, incorporating the former fighter into the system, we still have more problem coming. You also, perhaps as I said, I haven't read your report, the large settlements of IDPs. Those of you who've been there, it's like a town within a town. You can imagine if one day they bust out, what's going to happen to the delicate peace situation we have there. What are the permanent arrangements being made by all the donors in Monrovia? But above all, what we found limiting was haphazard donor support. The coordination is very, very limited. Everybody's putting an input, small part here and there, so that the overall impact it's relatively minimal. So these are just the key points I want to mention for now. Thank you, apart from the extreme gender-based violence that's so rampant. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll take some of those questions now. So there were questions around the structural causes and how much those have been addressed, links between peace building, state building, poverty and inequality, and then the regional disparity issue. So I don't know what from your experience you would have on each of those. Why don't, Craig, you go first?
Sure. I'll work backwards. So dealing first with sorry, I didn't catch your name, but the lady, Pauline. In terms of lots of donor support concentrated on Monrovia, it's very obviously the case. I agree with you, and I think it's a common problem in many fragile states. In terms of development outside of Monrovia, and this perhaps relates back to Alina's point about the structural causes of conflict. This historically has been the problem, right? That development has focused entirely on Monrovia, or at least coastal towns, which can be used to develop, for almost elite-led development. So I'd agree with you. If you remember I won't have time to get it up now, but the graph, the map of the country that we showed, with perceptions of security, right? So Monrovia had a red spot, but so did the southeastern part of the country, and that's historically been marginalised during the conflict, right? And there's still a lot of grievances there linked to the conflict. So I think, hopefully I'm tackling two at the same time almost here, but that these are ongoing problems, and I fully agree with you on that point. And of course, what some call the Americo-Liberians leading the country. When we speak, during our interviews, people mention that frequently. So it's still a source of grievance in the country. And it's a very interesting case for those who don't know much about Liberia to go and review that and see how that unfolded in a place which was not formally colonized, but in everything but name, it was.
Do you feel like any of the structural problems have been dealt with? Has there been progress made on any of them from what you understand?
Small steps. The big issue. Well, there are many, but one big issue is on resource extraction, which I ended on as one of the challenges. And there's been a lot of the right noises made, if you like. And I think something I didn't get into on presentation was that there's been a post-conflict narrative promoted by the government that sort of economic growth linked to resource extraction would somehow tackle some of those causes of conflict. Because historically, that's been the problem, that economic growth has not really benefited the population on resource extraction. The truth is, I think the right noises are being made, but the wrong things are being done, and that to my knowledge, maybe else tell me otherwise. People do not feel like they're benefiting still and protests are starting to happen and occasionally getting violent between protesters and security forces in Liberia on exactly these issues. So it's a real problem for the future.
Okay, and Joanna in Timor-Leste on some of those questions?
Well, I think East Timor has surprised us and it will continue to surprise us. For example, the textbook thing is to say there are structural causes or root causes of a conflict, and then there's proximate causes, and then all of this combined to and lead to a crisis. I think that the context of Timor is evolving so rapidly that it's hard to say this is structural and this is proximate. I mean, basically, sometimes the impact of a crisis becomes a cause. Anyway, this is a bit theoretical, so I'll give some examples. Just now I mentioned that the unresolved grievances of veterans, which are not just about money. I mean, throwing money at the problem is not going to resolve the grievances of certain groups of veterans. A second cause of conflict, of crisis, is the tensions that I mentioned between, okay, to use a shortcut, between the East and the West. And again, I want to say that there's all kinds of, it's not just East and West, it's much more complex than that. And then the third thing I mentioned is extreme poverty. These questions are still on the table. What I find is that government has put in some short-term measures to address these, and basically, has it transformed the issues? Not, I mean, I would say halfway. They have transformed a little. I mean, for example, if you have a track record of stability now since 2008, then the expectation of stability is there, and then the spoilers would probably be less encouraged to wreak havoc. So in a way, just having a track record is shaping people's expectations and their behavior. So I would say it could be transformative, those short-term measures. Now, if you have a static view of things, you would think, oh, the challenges on the horizon are really not, I mean, they're really quite scary. But the thing is, government is not static. Government is really actively looking at its policies and revisiting them. For example, if you think that 40% of its whole cash transfer budget goes to veterans, which are only 15% of the population, this is being revisited by government. They're saying, now we need to fight poverty, and so we'll be much more pro-poor than pro-spoiler. So yeah, and bottom line is government policies are shifting, and I think they recognize all these challenges on the horizon.
Okay, great. I don't know, Lisa, did you want to respond to any of those questions?
She might be asleep.
Are you?
Yeah, sure. Let me just pick up. Oh, sorry, I've got to turn this stuff back on. Let me just pick up on the questions that Alina and Kate posed. I mean, one of the things that so related to Alina's question on peace building and sort of how this connects to state building, one of the interesting things I think that came out of both the case studies is that actually the factors that help to drive progress in both the case studies are not what liberal peace building sort of conventional approaches have in mind. Actually, at least on the part of national government, security progress was achieved through quite illiberal practices. So whether that was paying off spoilers, whether it was sharing political positions with other elites, or sharing government contracts with elites, or cracking down on political opposition, these were the things that actually ensured a window of stability that has enabled some of the security progress we've seen. Now, nobody thinks that's a good long-term strategy, right? And as Kate's question alludes to, without creating a more inclusive sort of political settlement and setup, those things are likely to undermine security in the longer term. The challenge is, how do you convince elites and national leaders of the imperative of addressing equality issues earlier than they're currently addressed? And I think, it's hard to do. I think realistically, the only way we sort of can get around that in the cases we've looked at is by trying to convince elites that actually inequality is the kind of thing that will become a security concern if they don't address it earlier enough. And convincing them of that, I think, will make sure that it gets on their list of priorities earlier than it has when it's conceived of more as a human development issue.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think we have time for just a couple more questions before going to the next. So there's a question here. Well, there's a row of questions. Well, it's a question here, and then there's one back there. Yep.
Alba de Souza from the Council for Education in the Commonwealth. Both the speakers talked about resolving conflict at the local level, at the village level. And it's understandable that if at the village level there's resolution, it won't go up to the provincial level or the national level. With various ethnic groups living in one village or nearby villages, how do you resolve that issue? I'm thinking of how the conflict flared up in Rwanda and Burundi, and wanting to know if you had similar solutions. You talked about the veterans living with the people among the population, and how did the villagers come to having their own, I don't know, village council or whatever to solve the issue?
Okay, question here.
Thanks. Colin Jacobs from the British Council. My question was just about political leadership, and I got a good sense, perhaps in the Liberia case study, because I know a little bit better in terms of there being very much a sort of elite power settlement, and one knows of Charles Taylor and so on. I was less knowledgeable about East Timor-Leste and wanted to hear a bit more just about the current structure of power. But interestingly, both speakers felt that the situation wasn't that sustainable for different reasons, perhaps. But if you want to touch on the importance of leadership as well, that would be great.
Okay, I think we have one question here and then one more there, and then we'll leave it.
Lillian, I'm doing an MSc at the LSE in Gender and Development. Feel very junior in this setting. I wanted to ask, both of you mentioned gender-based violence and sexual violence, and in my understanding, especially sexual reproductive health in conflict areas, effectively that can be a very important issue for future stability. So what has been attempted and what has been successful and unsuccessful in both these cases? Thank you.
Okay, and then the question back there.
Hi, Sean Rodway from DAI Europe. I just have a question related to the debate around short-term factors driving sustainable peace that I know you mentioned, Craig. I'm just wondering, in terms of approaches, is sort of long-term development something that needs to be embedded a lot more from the start, or do you feel that it's something that needs to sort of grow more organically? I know you mentioned in your report about a younger generations of politicians being the sort of drivers for change, but I was wondering if how you resolve that sort of disjuncture between short-term and long-term sort of goals.
Okay, so we've got a question about resolving conflict at the local level, and there's actually a question online that is very similar around the role of communities in addressing conflict and what you found, and that's from Mo Kovacs. We've got a question about leadership, we've got a question about gender-based violence, and then a broader one on how you link together short-term and long-term factors and balance those in terms of driving progress. So, Joanna, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, no problem.
Switch it up.
So again, Timor is different from many other settings that we may know. Most of the population is in Dili, the capital city. So basically, you have the situation in Dili, and then you have the situation in the hills. That's how they call it. Let's talk about urban settings with Dili. There you have, this is very much a heritage, a legacy from the Indonesian days. Each block has a chief. Each neighborhood has a chief. I mean, it's very structured. No one can fall through the cracks. So there's always means of resolve. Whenever there's an issue, there are traditional and formal authorities to talk to. Same goes in the hills. Is it working? To some extent, but again, there would be probably a lot of promise in a lot of potential if there were more hybrid structures to discuss security issues where it's not just the business of the police, it's also the business of community. So there's room for progress on that end. The other thing, if I contrast it with Burundi or Rwanda, I would say Timor is a bit of a concern in the sense that when there's a crisis, the people from the east and people from the west would separate, like oil and water. Whereas in Burundi and Rwanda, when there's tensions, they don't separate like that. So that's a bit of a concern. So that's that on the resolution at the local level. On political leadership, there's been a shift since 2012, which were the elections. Shanana became prime minister, and he really made it an explicit policy of basically being we call it the big tent policy. His party decided it was smarter to distribute benefits to a large array of people, including former enemies. So you could say that the political settlement is very inclusive. Does it come at the expense of vertical relations, the relations between ordinary citizens and the elites? We didn't find any evidence of that because Shanana is such a sacred figure. He's really nobody criticized him. I mean, it's no one. They really underline his power to unify the country and make it a nation. So there's something to watch as well.
Okay, Craig.
Okay, I'll try and get through them quickly. First, I think it was Lillian with the SGBV comment. Sorry, there. I was looking over there. In Liberia, there's been actually a huge attention on this issue, partly because Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, as a woman, has kind of encouraged this and has actively pursued SGBV as in trying to have strategies to tackle it. One of the problems is that they have, for example, they've developed women and children's departments. I think maybe that's not the exact title, but they have these departments in the police stations now across Liberia. But the problem is they're entirely internationally funded. So you get into that position where you think, well, this is great, and it's fantastic that there's a drive in Liberia against these issues. But again, you wonder, well, what happens when the money runs out? So that's one thing. There is a big drive against it in Liberia, and it's also partly linked to kind of women's groups that were quite partly instrumental in driving towards peace around the peace agreement as well. So, yeah, that's that one. On local ways of resolving conflicts. You mentioned ethnic issues. One thing that, if you don't mind, I'll just reference Sri Lanka, which is some place that I've done a bit more research on, specifically those issues. And I often think that ethnic issues are magnified by local politicians or elite politicians for political gain. And I wouldn't necessarily, often it's not quite as big an issue. It's about the fact that certain groups, for example, aren't getting resources, and other issues that are controlled at a different level. So while I do think that local forms of mediation, for example, can be really useful in sort of mitigating local level conflicts, when we're talking about ethnicity, I think it's important to think about how these issues get magnified elsewhere. And the third one, long-term, Colin, I was going to leave yours because you said you knew Liberia to some extent. So I think it was Shell saying about having embedding development concerns from the start. I'd encourage you to read and comment on our Dimension paper, which tackles exactly this issue. And at the end of that paper, essentially, we come to the conclusion that firstly, there's a need to really engage with elites on their own terms, and we call that working with but not for elites, right from the outset, and recognising that you're trying to shift them towards citizen-orientated policies, which may be against their interests, and recognising some of the tensions in that. A second one is making sure international actors view support for security institutions and security sector reform as a political change process, not a technical exercise. And a third would be exactly about including more inclusive development policies from the start. And the truth is, of course, this mix is incredibly hard to get. But I think we're trying to provide some starting points in our paper, so we'd really welcome comments on that.
And I think that question and others, what we're going to do now is to be changing over to another panel of eminent experts who I'm not going to introduce. I'll have Alina Rocha-Menencol, who's going to be chairing that panel, introduce them. But I think a number of these questions will come up as people are talking about the broader experience as well. I just wanted to share one comment that had also come in over Twitter, and this is from Sarah Dewhurst, who was one of the co-authors of the Timor-Leste case study, and she made the point that it's really important that developmental approaches are also taking into account political and conflict taking a political and conflict-sensitive lens in terms of their own programming, and that's needed to address some of the issues of poverty and inequality from a very early stage. So that's an important piece. Lisa, did you want to say any last comments to either those questions or just kind of overall? Or have you left us?
Sorry, no,
sorry. Oh, she's there.
No, I mean, just on the last question about this tension between short-term and long-term.
Can you put your mic down, Lisa?
Sorry.
Thanks.
Sorry, I was just saying on the short-term, long-term disjuncture, I mean, that's precisely the issue that we ended up with, sort of saying, okay, our case studies suggest that this is how security progress is achieved in the short term. Everybody ideally, well, maybe not everybody, most people ideally want to move to this other vision of more inclusive, equitable security in the longer term. How do we make the shift from one to the other? We would like to, of course, argue that you should just do the nice inclusive stuff from the beginning, but our case studies don't suggest that ultimately that's been the way that security progress has been achieved. So the question then becomes, how and when do you make that shift? And I really don't think there's any easy answers, but that's precisely the question that we're trying to grapple with in this final dimension paper.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot, Lisa, for sticking with us. I think now we're going to show the animation, Rob, so if you can pull that up, and we'll turn over to the other panel, so Alina and others.